So you travel more than anybody I know. You spend more days out of the country and have for more years than literally anyone I know. So answer this question. The countries that seem to be moving backward the most quickly, this is my perception, are the white Christian English-speaking countries, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, UK, United States. Am I imagining that? What is that?
Well, I can't really speak about the countries of what they used to call the old Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand. I've never been to those places. But I certainly think that England, the UK more generally, but England in particular, is really in a difficult position now. And I think that the diagnosis that English people generally are coming to is that they've had too much immigration.
It seems like they've been overwhelmed by immigration, but you may have a better handle on the numbers. How much immigration has the UK had-ish?
Well, I think that they're up around, the country, well, most recent, the country's had a lot of immigration since, since the Second World War. It had some moments of acceleration. They had a huge wave of migrants from both the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent in the years right after the war, and by a huge wave, it's a couple 100,000. But more recently, we've had even larger numbers, and in fact, one of the things that has made Brexit so contentious in England is that the big promise of Brexit, the primary promise of Brexit, was to limit immigration. That's what most English people thought it was for. Now, Brexit was delayed between the referendum and 2020, and when Britain finally got Brexit, it had COVID, and so it had a period of zero immigration for a while. But then something really interesting happened, which is the people who had managed to get Brexit, that is the government of Boris Johnson, sort of looked at the numbers and they were very frightened that the economy was going to continue slow after COVID. And due to the way the British government scores economic predictions, immigration comes out as, by definition, a benefit to the economy. So seriously, they
decided,
in California. Yes, so they decided to just loosen immigration for a little bit, and the result was really extraordinary. They got, I think, 4.5 million immigrants between 2021 and 2024.
4.5 million?
Yes. And so we're talking about, in 3 years, we're talking about an immigration that is 7% of the country's population. And that immigration, because because Britain had left the European Union, was not European immigration. It was 80% of it came from outside of Europe. So it was a profoundly foreign immigration and the largest Britain had ever had. And it was brought about by the very people whose entire reason for being in government was to stop immigration. And it's had an extremely destabilizing effect on the politics of the country.
So they, according to the way British economists score the economy, more people, almost always from poor countries, make you richer or something?
Yes. I mean, it's sort of like it adds a certain amount of units of labor, and the country is that many units of labor richer. And there's not really a sufficient, without going into the economic details, there's not sufficient reckoning done of the fact that these people will age, they'll form families, and they will collect the generous and perhaps overly generous state benefits that they've been brought in to help defray.
Yeah, I mean, is there in the history of the world a country that's had like that level of immigration from poor countries that got richer because of it?
The United States, but it's a very special case because we had laid claim to a continent-wide landmass, although we didn't always do that explicitly, and we had only a very few millions of people with which to claim it. And so we really needed people, and they generally came from societies that were, or let's say they might have come from societies that were richer than ours, but they came from the less fortunate parts of those societies. So I think it did enhance the United States while we had, a more or less virgin territory. I understand that the Indians were there, but a lot of the territory was virgin and ripe for development. As long as we were in that position, it was a benefit to us. The mistake that other countries in the world have made, and Europe more than anyone, has been to assume that if they get mass immigration, it's going to work the way it did under the very special circumstances of 19th century North America. But instead, what's happening is it's working more like the circumstances of 17th century North America. That is, the people who are arriving from abroad are becoming the core group.
They're replacing the indigenous population.
That seems to be what's happening. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places.
But in Great Britain.
If you go to London, it's incontestable.
Well, it's overwhelmingly, it's like 70% non-British, right? Non-English.
That's right.
So can that be changed, fixed, reversed?
That's what the discussion in England is about now. And that's why the politics on the English right is so, it's so fractured. It's fractured, but it's actually very interesting. A lot of, there's a lot of sort of like new ideas sort of popping up out of desperation,
Like what?
They're mostly ones that you would recognize from, the Trump campaign. They have a lot of them have to do with deportation. There's a lot of discussion of withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights and from the UN, refugee treaty from the 1950s. The UN has a refugee convention from the 1950s that governs a lot of rights of asylum. And the Tony Blair government in the late 90s and the early part of this century passed something called the Human Rights Act, which made European human rights law and the authority of the European Convention of Human Rights binding on the UK. So there is talk about exiting those agreements, and to not just talk. I mean, this is the sort of thing that whenever it's brought up in a Western country, it's described as extreme right wing and fascist and that kind of thing. It's not just being talked about in England. It's being talked about by, I would say, the three main forces on the English right, which are Nigel Farage, who's in the Reform Party, Kemi Badenoch, who is the leader of the Conservative Party, and Robert Jenrick, who's the main sort of like radical, let's just say, the conservative alternative within the Conservative Party. All of them are talking about getting Britain out of the European Convention of Human Rights to the extent where you think if there is ever a conservative government again, it will happen. I mean, it's no less believable than Brexit was before Brexit happened.
You probably heard about 8 Sleep. Lots of people are talking about it. It is a company with one mission: improving your sleep. and it's changing the way people do that, the way they get a good night's rest. We just got word that their team is launching a new product. It's called the Pod 5. It's an original and innovative mattress cover plus a blanket that uses precision temperature control to regulate your body's sleep cycles and give you the perfect sleep, which really, really matters. It can range all the way from 55 degrees to 110 degrees, meaning that you're covered no matter what. It's like electric blanket to the next level, but also a cooling blanket. So it makes you sleep better. Temperature has a massive effect on the way you sleep. By the way, it also detects snoring. And then it adjusts your bed position to reduce or completely stop it. So there are a lot of ladies in America who are going to be grateful for this product. Everybody who works here will tell you, because they all use it, that there's no better way to be alert, productive, and happy than by sleeping well, and 8 Sleep really does help. Visit 8sleep.com/Tucker. Use the code Tucker to get $350 off your Pod 5 Ultra. If you don't like it, you return it within a month. That won't happen. We think you'll love it, but you can if you want. 8sleep.com/Tucker. But that's still, that's pretty tepid, really, like pulling. The country's been pretty much the same for 1,000 years. You can go to Stonehenge, pull up bone fragments, and trace the DNA to people living in Britain. So, for all history that we know of, it's been pretty much the same. People was something the French came 1,000 years ago or whatever, but there have been some changes. But in general, they're the indigenous population. And now in 80 years, they've been like overthrown, replaced.
It's extraordinary. This is an extraordinary anthropological moment. It's like
I've never heard of anything like that happening.
Well, there were have been a couple of examples of what the German paleo historians call Völkerwanderung, movements of peoples, where people move off the steppes in Asia
exactly.
and into Western Europe, and then they that's how we got our our Indo-European languages.
Yes,
and there's movements down through Greece and onto the Minoan area. I don't know exactly when it was, about 1,000 or 2,000 BC.
This is why the Russians and the Finns have kind of Asiatic eyes.
I don't know what happened when, but occasionally there are these huge movements of population. This one's a little bit different because it's enabled by technology. So it's not contiguous peoples sort of like pushing against one another. It's sort of people who are brought by boat and by airplane. But in terms of its importance, it's a major.
But I guess what I'm saying, the reason it's unprecedented, Genghis Khan, rolled over and impregnated thousands of people. But I don't think those people's leaders asked him to come and impregnate their wives. This is like the only invasion I've ever seen that was been bidden by the leaders of the countries that have been invaded. Like, come and invade us.
It's not like they were begging for it, but they sort of created a climate of permissiveness, that which people took advantage of, and it's I think what you're getting at is, what was the psychological state of Europeans between 1945 when they started doing this?
Yes.
And today that
That's
made this possible.
That's exactly the question. And I don't understand it.
And it's a funny thing because you and I have lived through the deepest part of that transformation, and it's still kind of a mystery to us. So if anyone's watching this 100 years from now, I hope they can see how confused we in fact were. But I think that in the wake of World War II, something happened in the middle of the 20th century, and it's really tough to say what it was. It might be a coming to consciousness of, after the horrors of the 2 world wars. It's like, you don't want to, this is maybe too moralistic an explanation, but, people began to understand that there were bad things could happen if you were too judgmental about other peoples or inimical. But there are other factors, such as just the technological factors, the visibility of alternative places to live through television. And that I think the technological are and the fact of easy travel through airplanes, and the fact that the telephone, the television, and finally the internet enable you to go someplace without being cut off from your ancestral homeland. So it makes the decision to travel abroad much lower stakes. The people who came to the United States in the 19th century from Sicily, they were gone. They got for the most part.
Never saw their people again.
Yeah. Well, in fact, in the Italian migration, a lot of them did go back, but it was in general it was a big decision. In the case of the Irish, I think they were usually here for good. Anyhow, I think it's a combination of at the level of statesman, I think it's a discomfort with any kind of expression of hostility or lack of hospitality towards other peoples. But at the operational level of the individual migrants, I think technology had a lot to do with it.
It's impossible, but yeah, technology for sure. But I don't know, Victorian England had the ability to move people around the world, to control the world's biggest navy and all that, and it would have been unimaginable. They didn't want millions of non-English living in England because they were proud of England and they thought it was distinctly English. And they thought, I guess what I'm getting at is, it's so strange to me that the self-confidence of Western Europe collapsed after winning the war. I think that's so, Germany's a different case, but Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, these are all countries that had nothing to be ashamed of from my perspective, certainly England and France. Why did they lose confidence in themselves after winning?
Oh, that's a sort of complex question. I'm not sure I agree that these countries had, they were all in very different positions. Germany, Austria, and Italy were the defeated powers and the malefactors in the war.
Right.
France had collaborated, part of France had collaborated, and there was a tremendous amount of soul searching, and there was a tremendous amount of guilt. Spain and Portugal had kind of resolved their own civil war in the 1930s, and they were kind of out of the picture. Yep. It would seem that Britain had a record that it could really be proud of, but it was dismantling an empire. And so the two main victorious the main victorious powers were the United States, Britain, and Russia. Russia was communist and had its own project to propagandize. But the United States and Britain, they also had reasons for self-examination. There was, I think there was plenty of triumphalism after the Second World War. It's a very tough thing to read. I think that the America I grew up in was really quite proud of its role in the Second World War.
That's what I remember.
Even as it was re-examining its own history, of racism and slavery and even the settlement and the wipeout of the Indians, So it was a mix of impulses. So I'm not sure these countries were as self-doubting as we think.
Well, the effect was to just collapse. Especially in the case of the UK. So is there any getting back to what it was even 35, 40 years ago?
It's funny. I heard a member of the Reform Party saying that what people really long for in England is a return to the status quo anti-Tony Blair. That is, Britain had a lot of migration. There was one wave in the 40s and 50s. There is another one that kind of coincided with the beginnings of our latest wave, which has gone on unabated. But they had a wave in the 70s and 80s, the British did. But the biggest one was intentionally started by Tony Blair. And this one member of the Reform Party says, if we could just go back to the status quo ante-Blair, that would be fine. That was only 30 years ago. But in fact, the amount of change has been so tremendous. And it's not just that the numerator of migration is changed. It's also that the denominator of the total population of Britain has changed. That is, Britain is a very, very slow growing demographic. So they're not really producing a lot of new children. And so a disproportionately large amount of the British people in years to come are going to be the product of immigration. So no, I don't see any, in general, there's no way short of like cataclysmic developments to reverse any of that.
We're sorry to say it, but this is not a very safe country. Walk through Oakland or Philadelphia. Yeah, good luck. So most people, when they think about this, want to carry a firearm, and a lot of us do. The problem is there can be massive consequences for that. Ask Kyle Rittenhouse. Kyle Rittenhouse got off in the end, but he was innocent from the first moment. It was obvious on video, and he was facing life in prison anyway. That's what the anti-gun movement will do. They'll throw you in prison for defending yourself with a firearm. And that's why a lot of Americans are turning to Byrna. It's a proudly American company. Byrna makes self-defense launchers that hundreds of law enforcement departments trust. They've sold over 600,000 pistols, mostly to private citizens who refuse to be empty-handed. These pistols, and I have one, fire rock-hard kinetic rounds or tear gas rounds and pepper projectiles, and they stop a threat from up to 60 feet away. There are no background checks. There are no waiting periods. Byrna can ship it directly to your door. You can't be arrested for defending yourself with a Byrna pistol. Visit Byrna, BYRNA.com, or your local Sportsman's Warehouse to get yours today. Byrna.com.
So it just kind of goes extinct. I mean, because there's no way that those two cultures can live and share power. I mean, that's never happened in history. One culture dominates in the end. You have a culture.
It depends on how separate they remain. I mean, let's look at the history of the settlement of North America. I mean, the British, particularly if you talk to Spanish historians and Spanish observers of this, were notoriously insistent on remaining separate in the lands they conquered, and they did dominate. In some places they were able to settle these areas. In other places, like India, they were sent home, after a long period of exploiting the place. But there were other nationalities that tended to colonize by mixing more. And so there's a mix of cultures becomes possible. The cultures that mixed into what we now think of as, different Latin American cultures were earlier on quite separate. There still is a degree of separation in South America between these different strains of like the European culture and the native culture of, but I mean, in most of Latin America, you can say that there's such a thing as Brazilian culture. There's such a thing as Mexican culture. And there will be, I trust, such a thing as English culture in 50 or 100 years. But it will be a very different thing than the English culture that we recognized over the last 500 years. So it is a rupture. You're right.
What happens to at some point, do the politics get radical?
Well, that I think is
because it makes me feel radical hearing about this.
Well, that I think is what's happening in England now, and it's one of the reasons I went to England, and it's why I think it bears watching in the next few years. They had a huge. They had a lot of riots last summer. I mean, there was an episode in which the British-born child of Rwandan immigrants, who sounds like he was kind of a crazy man, went to a Taylor Swift dance party that was being held for a bunch of little girls, and he stabbed a dozen of them and killed 3 of them, and the town in which he did it just blew up, and the and the protests spread across the country, and you had like a wave of really quite spontaneous public uprising, and that was just about a year ago in August. The government, which had just entered office, the Starmer, the government of Keir Starmer, the Labour government, chose not to view it as a spontaneous uprising. They described it as a reaction to misinformation and that sort of thing. That did not convince the public very much, though, and I think it contributed to the, in general, low popularity the government has enjoyed since then. It's a strange, just as an aside, it's a very strange situation in Britain where they have this Labour government has a landslide majority, although they've won only a third of the votes. So that in itself is very stabilizing. But I think the events that we've just been, the developments we've just been discussing have contributed to make Britain susceptible to radicalization.
What about Germany? I mean, Germany's also been completely transformed by immigration, but that's a society with less free even than Britain, and people can't even say it out loud. They've been taught to hate themselves and to keep that stuff inside. But you wonder, at some point, did Germans say, just had enough? And
well, I think it's worth it's worth remembering that that we had a lot to do with that German culture of denazification and sort of, let's say, German the critical German approach that they take to their past. And so Germany has never been a real free speech society. It's not a value that is held to quite the high degree that we hold it in our First Amendment.
Yes.
In fact, no other culture on earth really has that absolutist idea of free speech that we treasure, I think rightly. But so working with that German culture, which is not a pure free speech culture, I think that we reasoned, the United States, partly because of the circumstances of the Cold War, wanted to reintroduce Germany into the family of civilized nations very fast. I mean, we were talking about rearming them in the 1950s. We were talking about building a European army around Germany in like 1955. It was as an alternative to that the European Union was created, because that prospect really freaked the French out. Okay. Yeah. But at any rate, the United States really wanted Germany to be introduced to the West, and to do that, a certain number of ground rules had to be laid down. You know what I mean? Like you couldn't buy a copy of Mein Kampf. You couldn't. You couldn't join a communist party. You know what I mean? There's so yeah. Germany's free speech was a little constrained. It might have been constrained anyway, but it also had this highly critical idea of German history. And again, it's understandable, but there's a lot of great stuff in German history too. I mean, the Reformation comes out of Germany. Germany was the most cultured country in the world, with the arguable exception of Britain at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And I don't have to go through the list. It was only a matter of time before Germans said, well, can't we talk about the good things in our culture too? I thought that moment actually was coming around the time of the Iraq War. And I think that was Gerhard Schroeder, I mean, at the time, it was fashionable to blame France for the European opposition to the American adventure in Iraq, in which Europe has been spectacularly vindicated, I think.
Yes.
But in fact, I think it was Germany as much as France that was driving that, rebellion. And it was Gerhard Schröder who said, who is then the Chancellor of Germany, he said the foreign policy of Germany is going to be made in Berlin and only in Berlin. I thought that was happening then. At any rate, for a long time, people really lacked the institutions through which to express that German, I wouldn't even call it pride. It's the desire that, it's partly pride, but it's just the desire that Germany be treated like a normal country again, And I think now, 80 years after the war, and confronted by certain problems that actually require a certain amount of national pride to address, I mean, the Germans are beginning to talk that way again. They're beginning to say, we need to be Germans again.
So the people trying to wreck our civilization want you to be passive. They want you weak so they can control you. Weakness is their goal. No thanks. Our friends at Beam, a proud American company, understand that our country can only be great if its people are strong. And that's why they've created a new creatine product to help listeners like you stay mentally sharp and physically fit. People like to mock creatine. CNN doesn't like creatine at all. But people buy it because it works. Beam's creatine can help you improve your strength, your brain health, your longevity. It's completely free of sugar and synthetic garbage that's in almost everything else that you eat. Of course, you don't hear about it too much because, again, a population that is strong, clear-minded, and physically capable is a threat to tyrants. That's why they want you playing video games. To celebrate American strength, actual American strength, Beam is offering up to 30% off their best-selling creatine for the next 48 hours. Go to shopbeam.com/Tucker. Use the code Tucker at checkout. That's shopbeam, BEAM.com/Tucker. Use the code Tucker for up to 30% off. It's built on core values, integrity, results, no BS. Beam. We strongly recommend it.
It's interesting that AfD, the Alternative for Germany, is treated like an outlaw party by the courts in Germany, and yet it's growing in popularity. I was just reading in the largest German state, members of the party were banned from owning guns because
really?
they were
Is
quote,
that in
unreliable.
North Rhine-Westphalia? Yeah.
Can that continue?
Well, this is a big drama. Yes, it can continue. It's it's an interesting situation. I mean, the German, I'm not sure where in the Grundgesetz it is, in the German basic law, but the German Constitution permits something called the Office for the Protection of the Constitution to monitor parties to make sure that they're not dangerous right-wing extremist parties. And the goal of having that in the Constitution was to prevent any recrudescence of Nazism. Now, there are parties all across Europe that had certain antecedents, whether in the institution itself or in certain just personnel, the way, for example, Mussolini's fascist party was ended at the end of World War II, but a lot of its members went and they joined the MSI, the Italian Social Movement, and that sort of continued after the Second World War. And then there were offshoots of it. Many of the people in it became left-wing. Giorgia Meloni started a new party, but it had some people who were in the MSI. So if you want to trace a genealogy from mid-20th century fascism to certain European leaders, you can. And people do that as a way of sort of gaining talking points against
Constantly,
Maloney.
they do it.
Yeah. However, the interesting thing about the AFD, though, is that the AFD is not one of those parties. The AFD was founded in 2013 by a bunch of academic macroeconomists who were worried that the European Union, by guaranteeing the debts of Greece and other failing countries, was in an invisible way taxing Germany. So it was built around a very recondite complaint, and not a hate-filled complaint. And I remember interviewing the head of the party at the time, who was an economist named Bernd Lucke. And he was just a very nerdy guy. He's left, I think he's left the party since. But the party underwent two transformations. The first came in 2015 when Angela Merkel invited immigrants, from fleeing the Syrian civil war to come to Germany, and they began streaming overland into Europe, and were then joined opportunistically, as you may remember, by a lot of Pakistanis and Iraqis and Iranians and Afghans, and just a whole huge human wave. And a woman in the party, a very charismatic, sort of like mother of many children, named Frauke Petry, said, "You know what? We are the alternative for Germany. No party is arguing for an alternative immigration policy, and that has to be us." And so it became the anti-immigration party. But at the same time, it had, for similar but less noticeable reasons, it had attracted people who wanted a change in Germany for all sorts of things, including, what we would call culture warriors, people who wanted to change the school curriculum so that it denigrated Germany less. And then it became a whole big grab bag of parties, of tendencies, which it is today, although they are a much more united party than I think a lot of people think. And they're now, they got 20% in the last election, and between elections they tend to poll much higher. So they're a serious party. They have at times in the last few months since the elections in January, I believe, they have been the largest party in Germany in terms of opinion polling.
So if you have a country that advertises itself a democracy, a country, run by the people who live there, and over time the establishment excludes parties that represent the majority of the people, then don't you get a revolution at a certain point?
Maybe I think I got a little off track. There's one piece I forgot to explain. So there exists in the German Constitution this idea of banning parties.
Yes.
And I think that then when people understood it, it was something that was supposed to be done in like 1948, whenever like a gang of people, got together in one city. And that's why like there have been parties banned since the Second World War. Not in a very long time, and they tended to be, tiny little groups of what we would call jackbooted thugs. The idea that this mechanism could be used to ban the largest party in the country, and furthermore, one that was founded 2 generations after the Second World War in 2013, is not what the Constitution envisioned. Nonetheless, you can see the appeal of it for 2 formerly big national parties that are now shriveling up and want to get those votes back or want to keep from being swept away, Well,
of course I can. It's just such a violation of the core principle of a democracy that I just don't think either you have to change the name of the system. It's just, it's an autocracy run by people with power and everyone else shuts up, or you have to stop doing that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you have you've interviewed Callan Georgescu on this show. If you look at what happened in Romania and the elections last November, where he was simply disqualified because someone in the government asserted, without presenting proof, that there had been a Russian campaign to elect him, and managed to head off the next, his replacement in the second round of that election, which was delayed for many months, and got a member of the establishment into the Romanian government. It didn't really work like a democracy, and yet when it happened, people said, "Well, we've defended democracy. We've defended democracy against the voters." So it's the kind of thing that Bertolt Brecht would make a joke about,
right?
And yes, it's not small d democratic, but people have chosen to call this form of government, which is, you might call it like state of emergency liberalism, which is basically I think the most accurate description of what it is.
It's a great description.
They claim the term democracy, but I don't think they're doing so very successfully. And the parties that represent this state of emergency liberalism do not do terribly well.
It just seems like the spread between what people want and what they're getting grows wider every year. People seem to hate mass migration everywhere in the world. I don't think there's a single person who likes mass migration, really, and you can tell by their behavior. Yeah. Certainly true in this country. I think people have an expectation of sovereignty, which almost no country has. Like, a country gets to make its own decisions, but that's not in practice happening anywhere, with only, a few exceptions. And so there's so much frustration about that I'm wondering, what's the point where it bubbles up into something unmanageable?
Well, a couple of things. I'm not sure that I think that the gap between what people want and what they're getting is wide, but I'm not sure that it's widening. I mean, the election of Trump was certainly a call for more action against mass migration.
Yes.
And since he's been elected, the border has been pretty much closed. There have been deportations. There have been, certainly the rhetorical stance of the administration is against migration. I mean, Trump may disappoint his voters on other things, but on that one thing, which I think we agree is like a really central issue, actually the will of the people and the actions of the government have kind of converged.
I agree with that.
If there were to be, as I've just described, a conservative government in England, and it abolished the Human Rights Act, which would allow Britain to act in a fully sovereign way, then the way would be wide open to deporting people who did not have the right to be there, and certainly to stopping the ongoing traffic of small boat migration in England. So I think I think it is. I think it's possible things are getting better from a democratic point of view. You also said, okay, so at what point does this explode? I'm not sure it does, because one of the things that makes things explode is discontent in numerous and dynamic classes. And that's why, the Arab world was so unruly throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, because this was a part of the world in which people were having like 6 or 8 or 10 kids, and there was no place to put these young men. And there was a lot of martial dynamism in these societies. And in fact, wherever you have a lot of young people, if you look at the United States in the 60s and 70s, you have a lot of disorder and rebellion. But we're not societies like that anymore. We are top-heavy societies full of old, wobbly people. And these are not the kind of societies that say, darn it, I've had enough. These are people who need, I mean, the demographic heart of our societies is in people who are of an age where they need care, not where they're going to run out into the street shaking their fists.
So most of what the big health companies sell is loaded with sugar and fillers and synthetic junk. It's probably not too good for you. And that's why we're interested in a company called Peak. It's a modern wellness brand that is actually healthy. It's got clean, science-backed methods, all kinds of blends, trusted by doctors, loved by experts. It supports gut health, glowing skin, steady energy, not peaks and valleys, and it makes it really easy for you to feel good all day long at your best. One of our favorites is RE Fountain. It's a calming electrolyte designed to help your body recharge and recover overnight. It's got magnesium, no sugar at all, no artificial sweeteners, no fake flavors, and it gives your body what you need to hydrate and restore overnight, which is good. Everyone here has felt the difference: better sleep, more energy, smoother mornings. It has helped a lot of people here, and it can help you too. You get 20% off for life when you start your first month. Go to peaklife.com/Tucker, peak, P-I-Q-U-E, life.com/Tucker. Highly recommend it.
When the children of the latest wave of migrants to the United States are 18, so that'll be in 15 years, then you're going to have a really dynamic society. You're going to have a lot of people born in this country to immigrant parents who feel like they want a piece of it, and you're going to have massive change, wouldn't you think?
Absolutely. And that, I think, that's why I've tended to look at this, what's happening now with arguments over the border and with Trump as part of a process that will come to resemble, about a century later, the process that led to the New Deal. I mean, because I think the New Deal was the consolidation of a new governing system in a way that took account of the waves of migration that had changed the country between 1880 and 1920. We look at our present demographic change and we say, oh my goodness, things are really, what country has ever faced anything like this? And it's really, there really is there are really a lot of points of contact between what has happened with us and what happened to the country between 1880 and 1920. You have, people from, the initial argument is, look, it's all well and good to receive people, but this country is about a certain set of values. It's about, it's historically determined. These people who are coming know nothing of our country. How are they going to ever, assimilate into it? It's exactly the same arguments that you got in the 1880s, 1890s. Then you get demands for, like closing the border. And it just doesn't happen and doesn't happen and doesn't happen until 1924, when it suddenly happens. And then suddenly the only people who can come here are the people who are already here. Let's see, the only Americans are the ones who've already arrived. Those are the only foreigners. And that's why, if you look at it, it's why there are so many Italians in Argentina. Right. They came after 1924, when the Italians could no longer go to New York. And so from there, these people had no choice but to mix together into a new kind of American. And the people who said these people will never be able to adapt to the old American ways, they were wrong, but they weren't totally wrong. I mean, they sort of like the country did change to reflect the identity of the new immigrants. And then in 1932, when Roosevelt came to power, on the heels of an event that discredited the old elites, which is the crash, then he claimed the authority to basically reorganize the country in the name of this new mix of the settled Americans and the new immigrant Americans. And it knit the country into one people so effectively that by the 1950s and 60s, young Americans were sort of like complaining about how boring and homogenized the United States was. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so it can be done.
Will there, after Trump leaves in 3 years, will there be like a series of Trumps, or will the party revert to what it was?
Oh, will the Republican Party revert to what it was before Trump? Oh, first of all, I think Trump is such an unusual person that I don't think he can really be replicated, even if, no matter how hard anyone tries. He was a. I mean, he came to prominence because he had an incredible amount of, what used to be called brass at a time when brass was what was required. There are other people who have sort of who seem to have more of the, more of the qualifications that a politician would require. That is like patience and like an understanding of policy and things like that. You had people like Ron DeSantis seem to be offering that to the Republican Party for a while, but it's not what the country felt it needed. The country felt it needed brass. The country felt it needed someone to come in and insult, topple, and break the old establishment.
Was that establishment broken, like after Trump?
Well, it's still in progress. I mean, this is something you know a lot more about than I do, but I mean, if I look at Trump 1, I would say that it was an almost utter failure on Trump's own terms. That is, I mean, he used that list that Leonard Leo and others had given him to fortify the Supreme Court as a more or less conservative force, and he nominated a lot of judges. But I don't think that he ever understood where the actual levers of power in the government were. And so the same deep state that he had complained about was as strong on the day he left office as it was on the day that he arrived. And so one had the impression that he'd learned absolutely nothing. And so what has happened under Trump 2 is one of the most astonishing surprises in the history of American politics. Now, in Brexit, you had a guy who was kind of a genius in the workings of British government named Dominic Cummings, who was able to say, well, no, you don't need to win a majority in Parliament on this one. You just need to control the cabinet office, etc. Trump never had such a person, but apparently, and the details are still not clear how, apparently he acquired one or several in the course of his 4 years out of power. I think Steve Bannon is correct to say that the 4 years out of power were in Trumpian terms were a great blessing for him. So there's someone, I mean, maybe Steve Miller is a candidate for this, who has the most tremendous Machiavellian understanding of what can be done inside government. I mean, the speed with which USAID was dismantled, which in what seems to me, it was not really a cost-saving operation. It was like a purge of a certain tendency in government. Was really, whatever you think of it as an ideological operation, it was a tremendously expert operation in terms of government rejiggering. The executive orders that he has, canceled, and the new ones that he has passed in order to give a new reading to affirmative action. And I would say that affirmative action was in many ways the key institution of American government of the last half century, to render it inoperative, even if he hasn't fully killed it, is a constitutional revolution. So, yeah, this is, things are still in progress. It's very difficult to see whether an operation like, say, deportations, whether that is going to accelerate or whether Trump is really running out of gas and this is going to, but it's hard to see how it will proceed from here. But it's been a huge change. He's turned out to be a very significant president.
Can you go back a second? How was affirmative action the key institution in American government?
Well, I've always thought, and we've talked about this, that the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was it created a new constitution that was really at odds, a de facto new constitution that was at odds with what we thought of as our real constitution. And as, what it basically tried to do was sort of like create a society in the South where, blacks could live as equal citizens to whites, in public and in large companies and that sort of thing. But it wound up being an incredibly versatile tool. You could use it for anything. Once you had declared a sort of national emergency. So like getting women onto, like corporate boards or getting, bilingual education into schools, getting, protecting, transgender story hour. I mean, it just ramified into every corner of American life. And anybody could be made, anybody was under suspicion. And let's just say in corporation, it worked publicly and privately. In corporations, anyone who ran a company that was, larger than a few dozen people was understood to be under, the government's watchful eye. You could avoid being sued really only by establishing an affirmative action program. And so it became the means through which the government could approach any institution, public or private, and saying, we'd like to have a look at your hiring practices. We'd like to have a look at like how you've been behaving for the last, for the last year in your board meetings. We'd like to know if there's anyone you're hiring who has kind of an animus against black people or women or gays or immigrants. And so it had a very chilling effect at every level of government and at every level of society.
Is that over?
It is for now, except we now have a culture in which for 50 years, people, even in the most private, conversations, sort of have been trained to ask themselves, can I say this or is this okay? Or I'm not homophobic, but, and so you have a society that has really been trained to be scared. So a lot of this, yes, I think so. So I think that institutionally it's over, but culturally we are really not a people that has sort of like learned to use freedom, and that will take a long time. It'll take a long time to get an easy freedom of conversation back.
About things, obvious things that you notice, differences between people and differences between groups.
About anything.
About anything.
Almost anything. Yeah.
Do you see that changing? I see it changing.
Do you see it changing?
Yes, I do.
That's interesting. Yeah.
It feels like the term racist has lost its sting, like almost completely.
Yeah. I would expect that to happen. I haven't really gathered any evidence about it, I mean, for one thing, it's harder to, sue a person when the government has announced that it's not enforcing affirmative action, that kind of thing. So, I mean, it used to be that if you could just successfully attach the word racist to a person, whether through a lawsuit or a public relations campaign, no one could hire him. Do you know what I mean? It was a real.
Oh, I do know what you mean.
And it was sort of like, it was not as different from the Chinese social credit system, which we liked to deplore, as we like to think.
And that is no longer true?
Yes, I think that is no longer true. I think it's no longer true that institutionally you can destroy a person with that kind of imputation. However, it may become true again, depending on what happens in the next election. So people are wary. And I also think that we're not the sort of people that is comfortable going out on a limb anymore. We've become a very conversationally cautious people, or at least anyone who's lived the last several decades in this country. You acquire habits. I mean, I think that you can't expect a person who's had these very self-protective habits beaten into him over decades to give them up, in the same way that, people who lived through the Depression maintained their habits of frugality for 60 years after that.
Yeah. I remember when banks introduced ATM cards, they couldn't get people who grew up during the Depression to use them.
Well, that's a very good analogy.
Because it was just too spooky,
Yeah.
Do you remember a country where people spoke freely in conversation? Do you have memories of that?
I remember one where people spoke more freely. I remember, and in fact, I went to college in the 1980s. I think it was pretty free. And actually, when people describe the first really mention in the wider public of so-called political correctness was, I think, in the winter of 1990 to 1991.
Yes.
And shortly thereafter, you had the Clarence Thomas hearings for the Supreme Court, which introduced the idea of sexual harassment. And I got the feeling that things were changing very quickly right then. There were a couple of incidents then, and one that I remember very clearly was there was a Dodgers, an executive for the Los Angeles Dodgers named Al Campanis,
yes,
who got invited on Ted Koppel's show Nightline to talk about Jackie Robinson 40 years after he'd entered the big leagues, and Al Campanis had been he was not only was he not a racist, he had been Jackie Robinson's roommate, and he was one of his defenders. He was great, but he said a few things kind of the wrong way, like he gave a wrong answer to the question of why aren't more blacks managers, and he was ruined. He was ruined. This is a guy who had fought to bring Jackie Robinson into the major leagues. But I mean, you had, he lost his job. And I remember Maxine Waters, who was already I don't think she was yet in Congress actually, but she was very active in California politics already. So she wanted to be sure that he wasn't, secretly being given any benefits by the Dodgers of any kind. And I mean, he was just destroyed. This kindly old man who had been a friend of Jackie Robinson's. And it was clearly something was happening there. And I think that what was happening is that these enforcement possibilities, which are in the Civil Rights Act, that lawyers were getting we're getting more adept at using them for a growing number of things, like saying, well, of course you have freedom of speech, but if you say that in the company you own, you will create a hostile environment for your employees, and therefore they'll be able to sue you for this much money. So basically, without banning speech, you were able to make speech very uncomfortable for people.
Did that just play out? Is it just impossible for people to live this way forever and people just decided?
No, it didn't play out. It had to be rebelled against. And the removal, the lifting of the executive orders that order affirmative action by Trump was an absolutely necessary step. The decision not to enforce affirmative action was a necessary step. By the way, it was preceded by a Supreme Court case that appeared in its mealy-mouthed way to say negative things about affirmative action programs in universities, but it's clear that universities were proceeding as best they could to maintain it. So no, it does not play out. It's this affirmative action, political correctness, woke, this whole constellation of authoritarian and even totalitarian seeming rules. They are rules. They are not part of the culture. They are not the result of, a lot of people deciding we really ought to be nicer to trans people. They are enforced by the fact that if you fall afoul of these of civil rights laws, it can cost you your business and your reputation and everything else.
What's the real purpose of them? I sense that social justice is not actually the goal.
Well, I should add that this is just let's deal with this. I think that solving the age-old race problem in the United States was the original goal of civil rights.
Yes.
But the tools that were given to solve that problem included ways to overturn democratically made decisions in the South. That tool, that ability to circumvent a democratic mandate from the American people, from any people, is such a valuable thing for politicians to have. And so they started using it for everything. As I say, underrepresentation of women, underrepresentation of immigrants, underrepresentation of Hispanics, all these things become crises. And social justice actually was the name that was given to this. But it was always, and you can call it anything you want, but it always was a way of using the government to sort of order society. And the danger of it was that you could do that at a really, really micro level. You can do it at the level of like what signs people hang in the doors of their shops, and so it became kind of like the world that, Václav Havel describes in his, and that's why everyone started reading Václav Havel and Alexander Solzhenitsyn again, because our society felt like those Eastern European societies at the time of communism.
It was Soviet. It was totalitarian. Yeah. I mean, in the strict sense, it was
that's right.
Total control over people's lives.
Yeah. I like to draw the distinction that Hannah Arendt does at one point. A lot of people use totalitarianism to mean like a really, Mussolini originally used it to mean, like the state can be all competent. And a lot of people in our time use it to mean like a really, really, really bad dictatorship. But the way Hannah Arendt uses it, means like the state gets into the totality of your
Exactly.
of your
It
life.
doesn't have to be violent.
There's no nook of your life where the state does not belong. The state wants to be at your dinner table. You know what I mean? And listening in on you. The state wants to be, on your route to work and make sure, the state wants to be everywhere with you in everything you do.
Can we go back to that? So you said that this was not organic. The population never cried out for total control of its personal conversations or anything else. Mm-hmm. It was imposed on the population by the state. Now it's been rolled back by the state.
Right.
Run by Donald Trump. But can it be reimposed? Would people could President Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez be like, my goal as president is going to be to eliminate racism? Wouldn't people just laugh at her?
Yes. But there might be a confrontation. I mean, as long as Trump hasn't, removed these laws from the books, which he hasn't, he's merely sort of like suspended the enforcement of them, and he's unwritten some executive orders which can be reissued. I mean, it's a reprieve. So the interesting thing would be what would happen if, how would the public respond with, 4 years of living more freely if those freedoms were suddenly withdrawn. And this includes, you mentioned young people. This includes people, who've never had any experience of having politically correct censorship at work or that sort of thing. And I don't know.
You were saying last night at dinner that people often say the Democratic Party, when it takes power again, as it will at some point, will be a lot more radical. But you were saying maybe that's not correct.
I don't know what they will have the capacity to do. I don't, you say, well, how will people respond if President Ocasio-Cortez says, we're going to have, affirmative action and drag queen story hour again? I just don't know. But I do think the Democratic Party is probably going to, it's going to find something to, some way to radicalize.
At what point do economic debates reemerge? I notice as we've been talking about drag queen story hour and race and sexuality and all this stuff, there's been, in a way that would have been weird 40 years ago, but almost no conversation of macroeconomics in public. All the oxygen's taken up by the political correctness stuff.
Yeah, I think it's a very welcome thing that economics is coming back. You hear a bit of it when we talk about the tariffs. But Trump has really confounded a lot of the categories. I think that everyone has the habit of saying, talking about tax cuts for the rich and all that kind of thing. To tie this to what we've been saying with immigration. Immigration is a very important part of this economic question. An interesting thing about Trump's first term is that, as best we can measure it, it was a highly egalitarian period. And, we really only have accurate, undistorted numbers for the first 3 years of it because the final year of it was COVID. But it really appeared that the bottom quintile of earners advanced against other quintiles for the first time since the 20th century. And
Really?
Yes. And this is in the Fed's numbers that came out towards the end of the Trump administration. If you look at total economic performance, like the way we tend to measure it, okay? We tend to measure it by the mean, that is the GDP per capita. Economic performance was much better, or it was better under the Obama administration than it was under Trump. The economy grew more. However, if you look at the distribution of it, there were far lower gains for the very rich under Trump, but there were relative gains there were absolute gains, let us say, for the people in the lower quintiles. I think the 4 bottom quintiles did quite well under Trump, and that.
So his voters benefited, is what you're saying.
Exactly. Okay. So it's hard to say why that happened. I think immigration did go down, but mostly immigration was talked down. Okay. When you have high immigration is like a direct transfer payment from those who compete with immigrants to those who use immigrants, but
that's interesting.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
immigration really is a transfer of wealth to the rich.
Yeah. So when we talk about Trump and immigration, that's I think an important thing to keep in mind, and that is why a lot of people were really surprised by the shift in votes particularly among Black and Hispanic males to Trump in 2024, and people have sought to explain it through these cultural, factors that we've been discussing earlier today. Oh, was it Trump's, endorsement by this rap hip hop star or whatever? Exactly. But I think it might just be that people at that part of the economy, who tend to be, that benefited from Trump won, tend to be disproportionately Black and Hispanic. And it might just be a case of people just devoting their direct economic interests.
It's a little weird if you go through the Congressional Black Caucus, certainly among the people whose names you've heard, like the famous Black political leaders in this country, they're all for open borders.
Huh. Well, I think that is largely intersectionality. And, people talk about, people in universities talk about intersectionality like it's a theory about, how different types of lack of privilege intersect. Like, am I more discriminated against because I'm a Black woman or because I'm a lesbian and that kind of thing, or because I'm foreign or whatever. But actually, what intersectionality is, you've used the term on your show, but what I think it really is just coalition building. The civil rights regime created a system in which you could do almost anything you wanted. A minority could do almost anything that he wanted with government. You could do almost anything you wanted with government in the name of minorities, but minorities remained minorities. You couldn't get the majority to do that. So what happens is minorities the beneficiaries of minority government wind up making an alliance. You can't vote against immigration because you're a woman, and women's rights are immigrant rights, and immigrant rights are human rights, and human rights are gay rights, and they're all wrapped up together. So, and that's where the much mocked non sequiturs of intersectionality come from, like gays for Gaza and that kind of thing.
It's my favorite.
Yeah. So,
but really, you're just describing the Democratic Party. This is just like a theoretical overlay to justify retroactively a coalition.
The Democratic Party is the party of the beneficiaries of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
The Democratic Party is the party of beneficiaries of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Yes. And the Republican Party is the party of the victims of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Or those who have objections to it if you count among the victims, those who feel their liberties constrained by it. Yeah.
I would say curtailing someone's liberty is to hurt somebody.
Okay. Yeah.
Interesting. Does that change?
Well, as I say, I think it's in abeyance now. But if I could say another thing about immigration and the economy, there is a kind of a longer term process sort of working itself out as we create this, as we create through border enforcement, a tightening of the labor market on the bottom of the income distribution. It should do some very good things for the country. If you believe, as I think you probably should believe, that inequality is one of the biggest problems confronting the country, it's going to alleviate that somewhat. But it's going to do it in a kind of it's going to do it in a way that is going to hurt in places. I think people are right. I mean, I think those economists who say that immigration, that curtailing immigration is inflationary are right. And it's inflationary in a lot of ways that affect not just the upper middle class, but also the middle class lifestyle. Like the great proliferation of really nice restaurants. The idea that, when this experiment in mass immigration in a nearly open border, with Mexico began in the 1970s, there weren't a dozen sushi restaurants in Pittsburgh. I mean, people didn't.
There were no sushi restaurants in Pittsburgh.
This stuff, we tend to think that these amenities have developed because of our, improving taste, that we're just so much more discerning than our parents were. But the difference, I think, is this source of just plentiful, bountiful, really cheap labor for people who can work in back kitchens and things like that. So
there's when I worked in a restaurant as a dishwasher 40 years ago this summer, it was a diner in New England. Everyone was white in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. Everyone had a criminal record. Everyone was white.
That's interesting. But so when you tighten up that labor market, and suddenly you have to pay your dishwasher $1 more, $2 more, $3 more, the meals in your restaurant are going to get more expensive. So there aren't going to be, like sandwiches, gourmet sandwiches for $11.99 anymore. They're going to be like $28.99, and people are going to say, I'm going to bring my sandwich to work. I'm going to, and then the restaurant is going to close, and the country is going to become much more like it was, like what you saw the tail end of in your diner in New England. It's going to have crummier food. It's going to have, things are going to. There's going to be a lot more sameness. That's what the world of a low immigration, less free market, where there's less of a free market in labor. That's what a society like that looks like. The working class gets richer. They move towards the middle. Everyone gravitates towards the middle class, right? And economic institutions begin to serve the middle class. That is, you have a shrinking of gourmet restaurants and a concentration of restaurants in the middle of the road category.
So the middle class was the dominant portion of the country. It was a majority middle class country up until I think 2015. And did that change? And then the middle class is no longer the majority. Is that because of immigration?
Has a lot to do with immigration. Yes, globalization and immigration. And I think people tend not to mention immigration. I mean, people tend to say it's a mix of globalization, that is free trade, and technology. But I think that the most important part of globalization is immigration.
Why is it the most important? I mean, it has affects the most changes?
George Borjas, the Harvard economist, has said that, immigration, people always talk about, is immigration good for the economy or bad for the economy? And basically, whenever you measure it, it's tough to get an effect on the economy that's more than like 1%. It's so trivial. I mean, but what the huge effect is, which is like dozens of times larger than the effect on the economy as a whole, is the transfer effect. The sort of loss of jobs by people who need $15 an hour to wash dishes to those who will do it for $8 an hour, okay? And the benefit to people who used to be paying their gardener, $30 an hour, but now find it can be done for $6 an hour. Or more likely, they pay a guy who's got a team on his truck, and they pay him, $30 an hour and let him sort out how this is done. And he does it much quicker, and they save money. You see what I mean?
I do.
So it becomes a transfer from the working class.
So it doesn't necessarily, I think what you're saying is it doesn't necessarily expand your economy, but it just makes the rich richer.
I think so.
So that would explain why rich people, these are broad strokes, but in general, hate any conversation about immigration, immediately go to motive, you're a racist, and just aren't at all interested in talking about it at all, and why working class people really resent it. There may be other reasons too, but that seems like a big reason.
Yes, those are broad strokes, but I think they're roughly accurate. There's there's a French sociologist named Christophe Guillouis who's written books about how this has worked in France, and his thinking has really clarified mine on this. But, you basically in France, you have 20 cities that are like nodes of the global economy. And they like in Toulouse, you have Airbus, and where there are engineers and executives at Airbus, they have, African gardeners and there are nannies, and there are all sorts of people there. It's a global economy niche. When you get out into the countryside, none of that stuff touches anything. It's basically the economy consists of like returning, cans to the grocery store. This explains why, if you live in a place like Washington, D.C. or Berkeley, California, or Boston, people are like sincerely puzzled. They say like, how did Trump win? I don't know anyone who voted for him, and they'll say something like, no, really, I've talked to people of all classes. I didn't vote for him. My mother didn't vote for him. My nanny, from Jamaica didn't, who's not naturalized and didn't vote. She didn't vote for him. And the answer is the dividing line is not between rich and poor. It's between the beneficiaries of and the excluded from the global economy, right? That's the dividing line in the politics.
So when you give up open borders, you're really giving up like a whole way of life.
You give up the solidarity between classes in your country.
Huh. What does that mean?
I don't know. As soon as I said it, I realized that you could look at it in a different way. I mean, you give up a dynamic that brings the classes close together, which is that the ability of working class people to withhold their labor for more money.
Right.
You know what I mean? You undercut that. They become, it's why trade unions, when they were actual industrial unions and not arms of the Democratic Party,
right.
were, they equated immigrant labor with scab labor. That was what
they were behind the immigration restrictions of the 1920s.
So you give up that dynamic, but it's very tempting, there are other ways to look at it, but yeah, I think that's basically the best way to look at it.
Will China ever decide, as its economy matures and cools inevitably, that it needs mass immigration to China?
I don't know much about China. I know a little more about Japanese. China has had a tremendous amount of internal labor migration,
yes.
which is just about to come to the end of, and so its labor costs are going to rise. I don't know how it's going to react. It's very interesting that Japan has chosen, a tightening economy over a diversifying society. That is, they've kept out immigrant labor for the most part. And where they've admitted it, they've tended to do it on a temporary basis. You get a few Filipino nannies, and they send them home at the end of their term.
The only mass migration they've had in the last 100 years has been from Korea, which they controlled until 1945, and then the Koreans who stayed kind of pretend they're Japanese.
Yes. So I think that and
how's that trade worked for them?
I think it's worked well for them. I think it's worked for them. The United States is constantly, the United States has brought tremendous pressure on Japan to admit immigrants. And this is one of the things that I find, this is one of the things I find quite mysterious. But if you look at the pressure that this is one of the things that I think that USAID did. It's sort of an ideological arm of the country. But if you look at not just programs, but people in the United States diplomatic corps in the State Department were always sort of like browbeating Viktor Orban in Europe, for instance, for not being more welcoming of immigrants. But I think we're at the point now where we're in a moment of transition. But Japan is deeply in debt. I believe they have the largest per capita debt in the world, although it is all to themselves, so it's debt to the, so it should be workable, but there's still a Japan. And, as we've discussed, Japan decided that it valued its cultural continuity more than European countries did. And so Japan, if you go there, you'll discover is still, I think, the Japan that people who went there 20 or 30 years ago remember it as.
So they seem like the only smart country like in the world, because that does seem, no one's starving in Japan. Actually, Japan is infinitely nicer than New York, for example. Sorry. And Tokyo is, and even though it's bigger and more crowded.
Yeah.
I just wonder, is that, that just seems like the greatest win to me.
They think so because they continue to keep this policy, and there's not a lot of agitation for changing it, But I don't know. It's been a few years since I've been there.
Last question: are you hopeful about the United States?
Yeah, but I'm not sure that's saying much. I tend to want to be hopeful, and the United States has some tremendous strengths. It's got the United States has something has happened since I'm using Europe, which I think is the best frame of comparison here. The United States has got a lot richer than Europe in the last 15 years. I don't know why that's happened. The two societies seem to be converging up until, roughly the time of the financial crisis of 2008, and then the Euro crisis that followed it. And since then, the United States has peeled away by 20 or 25% from European standards of living. So it's richer. It seems to be in a period of democratic ebullition. That is the populace is engaged. This doesn't mean that they've made a right choice with Donald Trump or that he's always going to do the right thing. But the public is kind of vigilant, and it is reforming the country, and we've reformed before, so I'm relatively optimistic.
I am too, and you make me feel optimistic.
Oh.
Christopher Caldwell, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tucker.
So it turns out that YouTube is suppressing this show. On one level, that's not surprising. That's what they do. But on another level, it's shocking. With everything that's going on in the world right now, all the change taking place in our economy and our politics, with the wars we're on the cusp of fighting right now, Google has decided you should have less information rather than more. And that is totally wrong. It's immoral. What can you do about it? Well, we could whine about it. That's a waste of time. We're not in charge of Google. Or we could find a way around it, a way that you could actually get information that is true, not intentionally deceptive. The way to do that on YouTube, we think, is to subscribe to our channel. Subscribe. Hit the little bell icon to be notified when we upload and share this video. That way you'll have a much higher chance of hearing actual news and information. So we hope that you'll do that.